Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Andrea Isabel, and I am a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Science Communication Department. And then I'm also a public engagement with science strategist with Ciencia Puerto Rico. And in the next couple of minutes, I'll be sharing a little bit about one of our efforts, mainly focused on getting a better sense and understanding how community leaders in Puerto Rico are adapting to climate change, specifically extreme heat events. What are the barriers that they're seeing, what resources they would like to have, what they're relying on for information. So I'll get us started first with just a brief overview of what Ciencia Puerto Rico is. We are a nonprofit based in Puerto Rico whose overall mission is to put science at the service and at the hands of Puerto Ricans. We also encompass like the biggest network of Puerto Rican scientists. We are about 17,000 strong, the last I heard of. That number might be higher. And we have different programmatic areas. We do some work in science education, mainly focused on K through 12 audiences. And then we also have a lot of efforts focused on community engagement and science communication. And those are part of our public engagement with science unit, who I work with. And this is just like a quick photo of everyone on the team so you get to know their faces and become familiar. These are all my coworkers who I have been working on in these efforts. And I did want to take a quick second to talk about two of our projects, which will become relevant towards the end of our conversation today. The first project is Aquí nos cuidamos, which translates to Here we take care of each other. And this is a series of public health campaigns that started during the pandemic. And at first, we were just trying to find a way to communicate COVID-19 information in Spanish in a way that was culturally relevant, applicable to the Puerto Rican context. But this effort slowly evolved to cover different public health topics. We have information on vaccination, mental health, general like health prevention. And then now we're also creating materials focused on climate change and extreme heat specifically. All of this material is available for download free in the website that's towards the right corner, that aquinoscuidamos.org. You can download all of the campaign materials. A big component of this effort is our community ambassador cohort. And this is a group of community leaders that we work with in the creation of the materials, and they also serve to support the dissemination of the materials. So we give them the support for them to take these public health campaign materials and just adapt them to the priorities and the needs of their communities. So that's the first project. And then the second one is Ciencia Collab, or the Laboratorio de Ciencia Comunitaria, or the Community Science Lab in English. And this is an effort where we are supporting local leaders, and we have different cohorts of community leaders, and we give them the mentoring, the tools, the seed funding for them to implement their own community science projects that help address any need or priority in their community, and that help leverage any assets that they already have. So moving on now to Puerto Rico and climate change. Some of you might be familiar that Puerto Rico is already experiencing, a lot of the detrimental effects of climate change. A recent study pointed to Puerto Rico being among the 10 countries most impacted by the climate crisis. And we're seeing these climate impacts across 6 major indicators. The first one is temperature, which refers to an increase in temperature. Precipitation, which refers to both extreme droughts, but also extreme rain events. We're also seeing an increase in sea level and ocean acidification, and in the sea surface temperature. And then we're also seeing an increase in the frequency and in the intensity of tropical cyclones. When it comes specifically to extreme heat, for the last couple of summers specifically, just because it's the warmest season of the year, We have been seeing, record-breaking after record-breaking heat wave for the last couple of years. And just recently, we had 50 of the municipalities in Puerto Rico under an extreme heat alert. And for context, 50 municipalities represents like 2/3 of the archipelago. So that's the majority of the archipelago. So this describes how this isn't, an isolated issue that some areas in Puerto Rico are experiencing, but it's really an issue that we're seeing throughout the entirety of the archipelago. So the other indicator, which is precipitation, the biggest concern with this one is extreme rain episodes. We recently had an extreme rain episode in May of this year that led to 2 deaths in Puerto Rico. And the issue with the heavy rains, it's not only that they're becoming more and more frequent, but that these floodings are happening in areas that didn't have flooding episodes before, that they aren't equipped to adapt to this. So this is becoming a concern that's impacting more and more people across the archipelago. And then when it comes to an increase in sea level, the main impact of this has been coastal erosion. For example, I was just in Puerto Rico for the entirety of the summer and just driving around, going to areas that I, grew up in, that I remember seeing before I moved to the United States. The shortening of the shoreline is impressive. Like some areas had like massive, they were a beach basically. They had like massive sand areas. And now the water is up to the buildings and to the houses. So we're seeing a lot of people being displaced, a lot of buildings basically going to waste because of rising sea levels and coastal erosion. So this is another one of those impacts that we're starting to see more and more, mainly isolated to the coastal areas in Puerto Rico. When it comes to ocean acidification and also the warming of the sea surface temperature, we're also seeing basically the destruction of our coral reefs. For Puerto Ricans, I think coral reefs have almost like a cultural and emotional value. Like we're very proud of our coral reefs. Like I remember being young and like going to the coral reefs and walking around and being super impressed by how like colorful they were and all the fishes and all of these things. So we're basically seeing the destruction of this ecosystem, which is something that further exacerbates, the increase in sea level and coastal erosion as well. And then finally, that last indicator, which refers to tropical cyclones, Puerto Rico has a long history of hurricanes. We're in the middle of the Caribbean, and we're used to getting hurricanes every couple of years. But the intensity of and the frequency of those hurricanes has significantly increased. Some of you might remember in 2017, we had 2 Category 5 hurricanes back to back. So we had Hurricane Irma in early September, and then 2 weeks after that, we had Hurricane Maria. And even though that was like almost 10 years ago, the island really hasn't fully recovered from those hurricanes. So this is just like a long-term impact of, climate change and tropical cyclones. So taking just a quick step back to understand kind of what's going on in Puerto Rico beyond just the climate crisis, we need to understand that in Puerto Rico, we really are dealing with a lot of intersecting crises that further exacerbate the climate crisis. The first one, and just, so we're all on the same page, Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States for over 100 years at this point. So that already puts us at a marginalized position where we have less resources and less access to, funding to adapt to climate change. Puerto Rico has also been seeing a mass exodus of Puerto Ricans in the last couple of years. There has always been, migration kind of back and forth between the United States and Puerto Rico. But in the last couple of years, that migration has been mostly from Puerto Ricans to the United States. And this has resulted in a health crisis where we're seeing a lot of our doctors leave the island. This has also resulted in an aging population, which if you take the lack of doctors and an aging population, that's really a recipe for disaster, which overburdens a system like a medical system that's already suffering a lot. We're also seeing a lot of school closures because there just aren't enough kids to go to school. And we're also, since 2008, we have been in a fiscal crisis that we really haven't recovered from. It has been like a very slow recovery. And then finally, after the hurricanes, our energy and power grid system was already not the best. We were already having some issues, but after the hurricanes, we just really haven't recovered. So this means that island-wide blackouts and regional blackouts are fairly common. You know, I was there this last summer and I had like a blackout, even if it was for like 20 minutes, probably once a week. So that's just the norm of living in Puerto Rico. Going on now to government response, there has been a lot of frustration with how the government basically hasn't been responding or preparing for climate change. For example, we recently lost some FEMA funds for climate adaptation. We also lost some funds that were designated for the recovery from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And the government also hasn't approved the PMARC, which the PMARC is basically a plan that was proposed to the House of Representatives and the Senate in Puerto Rico that is like basically details all the things you would need to do to be able to adapt to climate change. So basically, right now we don't have a plan as an archipelago to adapt to climate change, even if we're seeing all of these detrimental impacts of climate change. This lack of government action has resulted, as you might expect, in a lot of frustration from Puerto Ricans, specifically community leaders. And this is something that we'll see once I get into the results of our study, how we're seeing community leaders, you know, be mindful of what's going on in Puerto Rico, really dedicate their efforts to adapt to climate change and to protect their communities, but they're doing this with like not wanting to interact with the government in these efforts, which just speaks to how frustrated they are with the government. And this is just one example of how all of these different crises and situations intersect. This came out, I want to say less than a month ago, but the CPI, which is the Center for Investigative Journalism, had to put a lawsuit to the Department of Education because they weren't providing accurate information on how ready the public schools in Puerto Rico were to adapt to extreme heat. For context, whenever there's an extreme heat wave, public schools in Puerto Rico will close. So that means that students won't be able to get their education. Their parents would need to pick them up from school, will lose a work day. So it has like all of these repercussions that further, you know, complicate what's already a difficult situation of living in Puerto Rico. And this is just one example. There are thousands of examples like this where all of these crises just come to fruition and intersect. As I mentioned before, community leaders are really, you know, prioritizing, organizing their communities and adapting to climate change. And this is just one example of how, like a flyer of how they're doing that. And as you can see, they're really doing this in an independent fashion without any, you know, government support or, you know, basically doing it on their own. And this is just another example of a community census that some communities in Puerto Rico are doing to support each other to get a sense of how extreme heat is impacting their communities. And again, this is done independently without any government support. Moving on now into the study that I conducted with Ciencia Puerto Rico, we conducted a series of listening sessions with community leaders with 17 total, whose ages range from 18 to 60. And we had a pretty decent representation of the multiple regions, like geographic regions in Puerto Rico. I do also want to emphasize that we had representation from Culebra and Vieques, which, for context, Culebra and Vieques are two island municipalities that are to the northeast of Puerto Rico. So they are geographically isolated, and this has meant that historically they have faced further and further marginalization, lack of resources, just access to basic resources. So we were very grateful and, put in the effort to have representation from those two island municipalities. During these sessions, we basically had a conversation with community leaders, explored how they were experiencing climate change to get a sense of which of these indicators that I previously mentioned was, most top of mind, more of a priority for them. And then we also did some kind of improvisational activities to see how they respond and adapt to any of these climate change situations. It's important to know that extreme heat was through and through the most top of mind priority issue for all of our community leaders. And the way they described this was that extreme heat was impacting them like physically, like it was something that was getting in the way of their day-to-day, like they were having to change routines and adapt. So it wasn't like an isolated incident or something that happened in like the high season, for example, like a tropical cyclone, but it was something that they were seeing consistently through the year. Moving on now to some of the major findings and the themes that we identified. The first theme is that there was this strong desire for localized action that is personalized to each community. This stems, as I mentioned before, from that frustration with the government, from the lack of action with the government, and this lack of desire to almost like cede control of any response or community-based response to the government. Community leaders were very interested in creating community-based response spaces that they own, that they could manage, that they could support, but that had nothing to do with the government. And when you ask them what they meant by a community-based response space, this basically referred, and they would always describe it as having a physical space, be it a basketball court, a local gazebo, a business in the community, a house in the community, just a physical space that had solar panels, so it wasn't associated with the power grid in Puerto Rico, that it had a fridge, so people, whenever there's a power outage, for example, if someone has insulin and insulin needs to be kept at a certain temperature, they could go to this fridge and not lose their medication. They also talked about having batteries, so if anyone needs to charge their phone, connect to Wi-Fi, or even if you have like a medical condition that you need some type of therapy that is, that you would need electricity to get, you could go there and get it. These spaces would also have food and water and just like have all the basic necessities for you to, adapt to all of these ongoing crises. And the final point in this theme that is associated with the frustration with the government is that throughout the conversations, there was a lot of thanking for having this space to like vent and to share their thoughts. And they always describe this as, oh, we've been trying to get in contact with the mayor, with their representative, with the government, and they just haven't done anything. So we're really grateful that you took the time to let us share what's going on in our communities. So this venting and just like grateful desire was pretty present throughout the interview. And then this is just one quote that refers and kind of touches on that government frustration. You'll see it in English at the top and in Spanish towards the end. But this community leader basically said how when we talk about communities responding and the third sector responding, this also cannot distract us from the fact that there is a priority and there should be a constant objective to continue demanding accountability for the government so that it complies with the public policy already in place and adds the necessary public policy to address the heat. Because after all, they haven't approved the PMARC, which is that climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience plan that I mentioned before. So for all intents and purposes, the government doesn't have a plan to address climate change. So community leaders were very aware of, what was going on in the legislature and the fact that the government they felt wasn't doing anything to take this climate change crisis into consideration. The second theme that we saw was that there was this strong desire to protect Puerto Rican culture and seeing our culture as a form of response. Um, some of our community leaders described extreme heat specifically as a threat to Puerto Rican culture. And the way they described this was that they would say that years ago, whenever they would look out their window into their communities, they would see people congregating, people checking up on their neighbors, people walking around, just like there was a sense of community in the areas that they lived. But now, because of extreme heat, people were staying inside, were staying isolated. They felt that people weren't checking up on each other as much. So they saw extreme heat as a direct threat to that sense of community and just like sense of neighborhood friendliness. And they were also turning to natural elements to adapt to extreme heat. Two examples of this are whenever we had a community leader who was from a coastal area, they would mention that whenever it was like really warm, they would walk to the beach to have their lunch breaks, or they would get together with their coworkers after work and go to the beach to get their feet wet, to get refreshed. We also have people who lived in rural areas that are in the center of the island, which are more like mountainous and kind of farm area. And they would say that they would take breaks and walk through the shade of the trees. And they relied on these like natural physical elements that are, a source of pride for all of us Puerto Ricans as like a sense of how they were adapting to extreme heat. And the other example is that whenever you ask them like what they would do to, prepare, they would mention that they would stay hydrated, but they usually mention acerola or guanabana juice, or like basically any juice that's like very typically Puerto Rican, before they mention, oh, I drink water. So people are really relying on these, I guess, natural elements to adapt to extreme heat situations. And this is just one quote from one of our community leaders who lives in Culebra, which is one of those island municipalities toward the northeast of Puerto Rico. So she described how you see a lot of people staying in, fewer people on the street. She has lived in Culebra for over 40 years, and there used to be many more walkers or people on bicycles, but now it's almost impossible. So it, referring to extreme heat, even changes the culture of the community. And then she goes on to describe how there is more and more isolation that is associated with extreme heat. The third theme that we identified was this desire for culturally relevant recommendations and solutions. Our community leaders were very concerned that a lot of the recommendations that or the guidance that they received to prepare for an extreme heat event didn't resonate or wasn't in line with what living in Puerto Rico means, is Puerto Rico's reality. An example of this is that whenever there's an extreme heat wave, the Department of Health in Puerto Rico might put out some guidance being like, oh, there's an extreme heat event, stay hydrated, stay indoors, turn on your fan and turn on your air conditioner. But given the context of our failing power grid and our electrical, difficulties, if everyone was staying indoor with their ACs on, that would lead to an island-wide power outage. So people were very concerned that a lot of these recommendations that they were getting just did not make sense with what living in Puerto Rico means. And they were also concerned that a lot of the guidance that they received was very individual. And instead, they preferred more community action or community guided responses. And this was very clearly seen when we, in our interviews, we asked them, how do you prepare for an extreme heat wave? What do you do? They would naturally weave together their individual response to community action. So they might say something like, whenever there's an extreme heat event, the first thing I do is I call my neighbor to see if she needs something, or I'll call my mom or this person to see if she needs water. I'm going out to get water. I can buy them some. So this like individual response was naturally tied to broader community actions, and they kind of wanted to see that reflected in the guidance that they were receiving. So this is just one quote from one of our community leaders who, and this quote directly ties to the air conditioning and that guidance that you received. So they described how when we talk about air conditioning, we see it as a short-term solution, but that also adds an additional challenge for us, which is the load on an energy system that is already fragile. So when we talk about heat solutions, we also had to emphasize how heat solutions are inherently a matter of public health. And this ties perfectly to this fourth theme, which is that you would see that our community leaders, yes, they were talking about extreme heat, but they naturally brought in and made these connections with some of these different crises that I mentioned at the top of the presentation today. So you would see how they were talking about extreme heat, but then they would bring concerns of food sovereignty to the conversation, how extreme heat is impacting agriculture and access to food, and how farmers and people who work in agriculture are having to make changes to like their cultivation methods. And this, was unprompted. This was like naturally they made these broader connections. There were also conversations around the impact of extreme heat on mental health. And this was mainly associated with either younger audiences and, how extreme heat can impact their ability to concentrate and to do their schoolwork and just to be more present. But they also mentioned how extreme heat was impacting older folks and how that mental health baggage of like, oh my God, I need to adapt to these extreme heat events. You're just like more tired. So again, they made these connections. And then the third point, which I just mentioned, is with concerns over Puerto Rico's aging population and how they are more and more vulnerable to these extreme heat events. And this is just a quote that ties into that mental health conversation. So we had one of our younger community leaders mention how she has to take it slower during the day because the heat affects my ability to concentrate. So concentration is a challenge. And I mean, also the hotter it gets during the day, the more overwhelming it feels, the more overwhelming the situation becomes. So this is a perfect example of that connection between extreme heat and mental health. Our final theme was just general recommendations that they brought us about how they wanted to receive information, what things they wanted to see moving forward. The first one was that they identified a limitation of educating about heat. Um, and the concern here is because Puerto Rico is an archipelago in the Caribbean. We don't really have seasons. We basically have summer all year round, sorry. We see heat and warm weather as a normal thing of being, an archipelago in the Caribbean. So some of our community leaders were concerned that when they were talking about these issues to some of their community members, they thought people weren't really connecting the difference between, yes, it's, we're used to heat, but an extreme heat event is something else, and you need to be able to prepare for that. So this is something that we have been toying with at Ciencia Puerto Rico. How do we communicate about extreme heat in a place that's used to warm weather? And then the second point was that they wanted us to focus any content that we created or any educational content that was created on educating people about actions to take for adaptation over giving people like the mechanics of how climate change happens, like defining maybe like what it is. They were well aware that we are already experiencing all the negative impacts of climate change. They just wanted to know, what can I do to adapt and to have like an easier transition, how to stay healthy within these circumstances. And this is just one quote that ties into the difficulty about communicating about extreme heat. So we had this community leader mention how they perceive that talking about heat in Puerto Rico and emphasizing how dangerous heat is a communication challenge in itself, because we live in a tropical archipelago where heat is relatively normal for us, sorry. So from a communication point of view, from the perspective of creating campaigns and emphasizing this as a public health issue, it's difficult to convince people that, that heat multiplies health challenges, that heat multiplies difficulties, that heat even kills. So this is just a person like encapsulating perfectly what that challenge is in communicating about extreme heat in this context. So moving on to our next steps, we are still mostly in the preliminary phase of this study. We are slowly building up a broader effort to address extreme heat in Puerto Rico. I am in the middle of scheduling additional sessions, listening sessions with some of the vulnerable groups that were identified in these conversations. The main groups that were identified were elderly folks, young adults, and the deaf community. I have also been interacting with a bunch of different organizations in Puerto Rico to get a sense of what work they're doing, how we can establish partnerships with the goal of like not duplicating efforts and seeing how we can maximize each other's efforts. And then we have been already translating some of these findings to Aquí Nos Cuidamos, which is that public health campaign effort I mentioned at the beginning, and then Ciencia Collab, which is the community science effort. I did want to take a quick second just to highlight how we'll be conducting the session with the deaf community. Because, we have a history of working with the deaf community. All of our educational materials for Aquí Nos Cuidamos have a deaf community component. So we were aware of that, having these conversations with the deaf community was going to be different. We would have to conduct those in a different way. We just weren't aware of maybe how big that knowledge gap was. We have been in conversations with we have a consultant who's a deaf interpreter, and she basically indicated that climate change isn't something that the deaf community really talks about. She even did like a very informal kind of census with different deaf interpreters and deaf folks who she interacts with, and basically gathered the same information that very few people in the deaf community have a sense of climate change and what it is and what its impacts are. So these sessions will be much more focused on sharing foundational climate change education and information to address those significant knowledge gaps. And just to emphasize, these knowledge gaps are a direct response of, lack of educational resources and lack of government, response to address the needs of these groups. She also encouraged us to develop visual and video-based materials created by deaf interpreters to, ensure that the information is shared in a culturally relevant way. So we're basically in the works of doing all of these things to be able to conduct that session. And then when it comes to how we're already adapting this information to our different efforts, this is just one example from a short extreme heat campaign that we launched with Aquí Nos Cuidamos. This is just one example focused on like encouraging people to drink more water whenever there's an extreme heat event. We are hopefully, pending funding, we'll be able to create like a more full-fledged extreme heat campaign in the next couple of months. This is also another example this is a short screenshot of a section of our newsletter. And this includes information on that intersection between mental health and extreme heat. And it just provides some insights into how extreme heat can impact your mental health. So we'll continue to share some information through our newsletter that is directly informed by some of the findings that we have identified through these conversations with community leaders. And then finally, this is a photo of the launch of our second cohort of the Ciencia Collab, or that community science effort that I mentioned before. And we're already seeing how some of the community leaders we're working with are already interested in climate change topics. So we'll be supporting them as they basically create their own, community-based climate change projects. So that is it for me. I'm happy to take any questions, just have a conversation. And this is all my contact information, so I'm happy to engage with anyone who might be interested. Thank you so much.